Hey everybody, this is Dr. Holcomb. Today's video is titled Working with Sources, and it's geared primarily towards your second essay, your research argumentative essay. This is where this is going to come into play. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, 4 topics. Traditional classification. This is probably language that you're already familiar with. A new functional classification called by the acronym BEAM, evaluating sources and examples. This entire presentation is based on an article by Joseph Bizup. If you see at the bottom here, based on BEAM, Rhetorical Vocabulary for Teaching Research-Based Writing, Rhetoric Review, Volume 27, Issue 1, 2008, pages 72 through 86, and print. The reason I went over that is because this is a correct MLA formatting, and for your research paper you're going to use MLA style documentation. I'm not going to teach you MLA style documentation because I think the way you learn how to do MLA documentation is by doing MLA documentation. So that means just sitting down with the Little Penguin Handbook on your lap, open up to the section on MLA. It's the light blue section in your handbook, and just kind of, okay, what kind of source do I have? What's the appropriate formatting, both for in-text citations and citations in works of lists cited. So just use that as a guide. Okay, let's move on to the first topic, traditional classification. These are terms that you've probably already seen before. The traditional way of thinking about sources is as primary, secondary, and tertiary. The primary sources include basically documents that are looked at for their own sake. These are written or created during the time under study. These would be speeches, letters, official records, interviews, a poem. Can even be artifacts like pottery or furniture. And let's just take your rhetorical analysis for an example. If you're doing it on President Obama's bin Laden speech, then the speech itself is a primary source. Secondary sources are sources that discuss primary sources, and these might include something like a literary interpretation of Hamlet or a rhetorical analysis of MLK's, Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, or a history of neoclassical architecture. Here's an example where you're looking at artifacts and not just texts. Your rhetorical analysis is a secondary source, because if somebody wanted to know more about the Obama bin Laden speech, they could read your rhetorical analysis to gain some insight on that speech's meaning and effect. A tertiary source summarizes or synthesizes secondary sources, and it might include something like a book on different schools of literary criticism or a bibliographic essay on histories of architecture. Now, according to Bizup, there's a problem with this classificatory scheme. He says that the traditional classification scheme is arhetorical because it ignores how writers use sources and what purposes they might serve. So what does that mean? Let's go back for a second. Let's go back. Remember, I just said that your rhetorical analysis was a secondary source because it's about a primary source, a speech or an essay that we've read so far. But imagine a situation in which a writer was writing your biography and was looking at your rhetorical analysis, had that as documentation about, your interest or your abilities at this particular time in your life, and that the biographer was using that to write his or her biography. In that sense, what I was calling your secondary source, the rhetorical analysis, becomes a primary source in that context of writing a biography. So that's what Joe Bizup is after. He's trying to capture a much more functional, much more rhetorically attuned scheme for talking about sources. And that's where this BEAM system comes in. BEAM stands for 4 different types of sources: background, exhibit, argument sources, and method sources. Background sources include materials whose claims the writer accepts as fact and expect readers to do the same. These might be statistics, they might be what in the old scheme was called a primary source. It could be videotape. Exhibit sources are materials writers offer for explication, analysis, or interpretation. And just to go back to your rhetorical analysis, an exhibit source would be, for example, President Obama's Bin Laden speech, where you're offering that up as an exhibit of rhetorical practice. Argument sources are materials whose claims writers affirm, dispute, refine, or extend. Argument sources are going to be predominant in your next essay, the research argumentative essay. And in terms of Graff and Birkenstein, it's the they say part. These are claims about an issue that are out there that you're engaging. Method sources are materials from which writers derive, a governing concept or manner of working. Again, think in terms of your rhetorical analysis. A method source would be, say, Aristotle, from where we get terms like ethos, pathos, and logos, and kairos in rhetorical situation. That vocabulary allows us to go about the business of interpreting or creating a rhetorical analysis. So it's a method. It's not something that we argue against. And I guess it kind of blurs over to a background source because we sort of presume or assume that those categories are real and useful. Bishop summarizes it nicely. If you look down at the bottom of this slide, writers rely on background sources, interpret or analyze exhibits, engage arguments, and follow methods. Now, an important component of working with sources is evaluating sources. This is especially important in academic writing, but it's also important in other kinds of writing, journalism, for instance. And here are 5 questions you might ask yourself when you're selecting a source and deciding whether it's worth incorporating into your paper. Who published the text and through what medium? Was it a university press, an academic journal, a newspaper, entertainment magazine, and blog? In an academic context, unsurprisingly, a university press or academic journal has the greatest ethos, has the most credibility. A newspaper or a magazine like the New Yorker or Atlantic or Harper's is, in this class, an acceptable source, a kind of respected journalistic magazine. Entertainment magazine like Entertainment Weekly, not so much, unless it's being used as an exhibit source, that you are analyzing some sort of practice or behavior that happens in entertainment magazines and you want to use excerpts from the magazine as an exhibit. And a blog, typically no. Again, unless it's an exhibition source. There are some academic blogs that would qualify as a legitimate source, but political blogs tend to be very biased, so I would stay clear of those. Who is the author? What is his or her credentials, experiences? Do they have any hidden agendas? Again, think back to the blog author. What particular political investment does he or she have? For what audience is the text written? Experts, general public, special interest group? Again, that gives you some indication or some way into thinking about how to evaluate a source. Materials written for experts, it carries the most credibility. Special interest groups, say, again, like the audience for a blog, less credibility. What sources does the author rely on? That's a good indirect way of gauging the value of the current source. Is it using academic sources? Or is it citing an entertainment magazine? And then finally, does the text have an obvious bias? Okay, I think that one's pretty much self-explanatory. Let's go ahead and look at some examples. And for that, I've got a little some excerpts from an article that I've talked about before. This is an article, again, at the top here. This is correct MLA citation for Works Cited page. It's an article by Jeffrey Boehm, The Daily Show, Discursive Integration and the Reinvention of Political Journalism. Let's look at the first one. And as I read it, go back to this classificatory scheme, back to the beam, background, exhibit, argument, and method source, and try to figure out what each one of these examples is exhibits or belongs to which category. So let's look at the first one. According to a 2002 Pew Research Center study, the audiences for most forms of television news fell considerably between 1993 and 2002, with the audience for nightly network news down 46%, network news magazines down 54%, local news down 26%, and CNN down 28%. This, well, to me, this is a background source. The Pew Research Group or Pew Research Center is a fairly well-known, well-established research center, and these numbers are being presented as facts that the writer believes, and facts that the writer expects you to take at face value. Let's look at the next one. The show's host, comedian Jon Stewart, and his co-producers labeled their work as fake news and insist that their agenda simply is to make people laugh. And there's an internal citation. The label of fake news has provided the primary frame for conversations about the show, both in popular and academic circles. That moniker, however, is problematic on two levels. Can you figure out what kind of source this is? This last sentence kind of gives the game away. It's an argument source. Here, the writer, Jeffrey Boehm, is taking issue. He's going to dispute that way of labeling The Daily Show as fake news. And we know here he has at least two problems with that particular label. So that's an argument source. Let's go to the next one. This one. The Daily Show is a product of emerging arrangements in the media environment, or what Newman, 1996, has called the infrastructure of political communication. We can identify three interrelated yet distinct structural transformations, developments on the level of technological, economic, and cultural that are redrawing the boundaries of journalism and the public sphere. Any guesses, any ideas what kind of source this is? When there's a technical term like infrastructure, and you have a list of concepts, developments on three levels of technological, economic, and cultural, you're probably in the realm of a method source. That's what Boehm is using the Newman and later the Bennett and the Entman to do. This is going to be part of the vocabulary that he uses to leverage an interpretation of The Daily Show. And then finally, this source. For one, the comedians delight in emphasizing that they are playing the role of reporter, suggesting that many of those who posture as real journalists likewise are playing a role. They claimed a constantly changing list of praiseworthy titles, including Senior Baghdad Bureau Chief, Senior Election Terrorism Correspondent, and Senior Vice Presidential Historian, targeting the tenuous claim to expertise broadcast journalists so often make. The revolving credentials emphasize the point that in a contemporary media environment, expertise is a conferred rather than an earned status. These quotes here are sources. They're actual quotes from transcripts of The Daily Show. In that sense, they're being used as exhibit sources. So in your rhetorical analysis, when you quote an excerpt from, say, the Bin Laden speech or from a passage from the sleepover question, you're using those sources as exhibits. Okay, I hope this helps you understand or think about different ways of classifying sources, and also when you come to use sources in research paper number 2, a better sense, a much more conscious awareness of what you're doing when you're